I was 31 years old the morning the Velhari Accord Signatories voted to seal the channel, and I remember the light in the gallery more than anything else. The commission chamber on Velhari Station ran its lighting through a spectrum modulator calibrated for the dominant species on the floor, a pale, slightly greenish white that the Kathrani found comfortable and that made every human face in the room look slightly ill. I was sitting in the observer's row on the upper tier, a level above the delegations, with my data tablet propped on my knee and a headset threaded behind one ear. My job was signals intelligence, specifically monitoring the treaty body's internal communication frequencies during open session to confirm that no side-channel coordination was occurring during. It was delicate, painstaking work. Most days nothing happened. That morning a great deal happened, and none of it was on any frequency I was monitoring. The signatories convened at the third hour, station time. There were 11 member species represented at the floor-level tiers, each delegation seated in a curved arc facing the central podium where lead coordinator Vethran Sol stood. Vethran Sol was Kathrani, tall, pale, with the elongated cranial structure common to that species' elder class, and a posture of such uninterrupted dignity that I had spent 3 years watching him and still could not determine whether it was biological or cultivated. He ran the commission floor with a precision that I had come to respect even when I disagreed with what the commission was doing. That morning I disagreed with profoundly. Our delegation sat in the arc opposite the Kathrani anchor block. Senior Envoy Dara Maris led, flanked by 2 technical attachés and our legal officer. I had worked with Maris for 6 of my 11 years in the service. She was 54, compact woman with gray-threaded dark hair who wore formal diplomatic attire, with the same unconscious ease that other people wore old clothes. She had a habit in moments of institutional pressure of becoming very still. Not rigid still, the way water goes still before you realize how deep it is. I had learned to watch for that stillness. It was, in its way, the most informative signal I ever tracked. The session opened with procedural readings. The Accord's chief clerk, a Theresi named Onvith, read the agenda in the Velhari standard language, and then in the trade pidgin, the commission used for mixed species floor debate. I followed along in my earpiece. Article 9 of the proposed Helion Compact was listed third on the agenda. There are 2 items on corridor transit certification that passed without discussion in the first 20 minutes. It was efficient, the way the commission worked. Efficient in the way that a mechanism is efficient. Every part moving in its assigned direction, the overall motion inexorable. I knew what Article 9 said. I had been reading it for 4 months since the draft compact had been circulated. In plain language, it provided that any signatory species which had, within the preceding 6-year window, registered fewer than the minimum threshold of certified diplomatic contacts through the primary Velhari channel would be assessed as having materially failed their communications obligations under the original accord. The remedy for that failure was suspension of primary channel access for a period of no less than 12 years, renewable at the Commission's discretion. Earth had registered exactly 41 contacts in the preceding 6 years. The threshold was 42. I am not going to tell you that was accidental. It was not. The 42 contact threshold had been written into the draft compact by the Kathrani-led working group with Earth specifically in mind. I knew it. Maris knew it. The legal officer had documented it. The Commission's drafting records showed that the threshold had been revised upward 3 times during the drafting phase, each revision happening in the weeks following the submission of Earth's channel contact tallies. The revision history was not a secret. It was in the Commission's own archive. The signatories either did not care or had calculated that we could not do anything about it in time. They were correct that we could not do anything about it in time. They were incorrect about what that meant. Vethran Sol called Article 9. The floor opened for comment. 2 delegations registered formal support statements, the Kathrani Anchor Block and the Ardesi Trade Representatives, whose relationship with the Kathrani Anchor Block was not cordial but whose interests on this particular aligned. 1 delegation, the Theresi, registered a procedural objection on the grounds that the retrospective contact threshold violated Article 3 of the original accord. which had guaranteed all member species a 6-month remediation window before any channel access sanction could be applied. Heard the objection, noted it for the record, and ruled it non-binding on the grounds that the Helion Compact was a new instrument and, therefore, not subject to the remediation provisions of the original. Maris did not speak during the comment period. She sat with her hands folded on the table, in that stillness. I watched her from the gallery. I watched the legal officer make a notation. I watched one of the technical attachés lean close to Maris and say something in a very low voice. Maris did not respond. She was watching Velhari Sol. The vote was called at the 47th minute of the session. 11 member delegations, 1 vote each. The Kethrani bloc and the Ardesi voted yes immediately, then the Andrani, the Theresi, the Velhari home delegation, the Sulvan, the Karadesi. 7 yes votes before the tally had been open. For 2 minutes, the Theresi abstained. The remaining 3 delegations, the Varath, the Solesi, and a small species called the Halvendi, whose single representative I had spent 3 years trying to identify by name, voted yes as well. 11 yes votes, 1 abstention, 0 no votes. Article 9 of the Helion Compact passed. Earth's primary Velhari channel was sealed, effective at the close of the session. The human delegation's credentials were suspended, pending the outcome of a 12-year review cycle. Maris and her staff were given 4 hours to file final documentation before their access to the commission systems would be terminated. Velhari Sol announced all of this in the measured tone he used for everything, as if reading a weather report. Then he looked at the human delegation's arc and said, "In the trade pigeon, the commission thanks the Earth delegation for its participation in the Velhari Accord process and wishes its members safe passage." It was a dismissal, polite in its grammar, not polite in its intent. Maris looked at him for a moment. Just a moment, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Then she gathered her documents from the table, stood, and walked out of the chamber without speaking. The 2 technical attachés followed her. The legal officer paused at the arc's edge to pick up a satchel, and then he walked out as well. 4 humans, walking in a line out of a chamber of 11 alien delegations, without a word spoken. I sat in the gallery and watched them go. I watched Velhari Sol watch them go. I watched because it was my job to watch the faces of the other delegations. The Kethrani bloc appeared satisfied, a subtle thing with Kethrani, but readable if you knew what to look for. A slight elongation of the posture, a settling of the shoulders that corresponded to what a human would recognize as relief. The Ardesi representatives were already consulting their tablets. The Theresi abstainer, a senior diplomat named Onvath Vel, whom I had met twice in corridors, was looking at the door through which the human delegation had exited with an expression I could not immediately classify. It took me a moment, then I placed it. It was the expression of someone who had voted for something and immediately begun to wonder if they should have. I noted that expression in my signals report later that evening and flagged it as a potential avenue for future engagement. Onvath Vel had been a consistent voice in the Theresi delegation for measured multilateralism. Not pro-Earth, particularly sympathetic to Earth's position in any ideological sense, genuinely and on principle, uneasy about procedural instruments that closed rather than opened. He had made the procedural objection that morning. He had been overruled. He had voted yes anyway, which told me that the Theresi senior delegation had calculated the political cost of a no vote as too high to bear and had instructed Onvath Vel to follow the bloc. That he had then abstained rather than voted yes told me that either his instructions had softened at the last moment or he had simply been unable to bring himself to do it. Either way, it was a data point worth keeping. Filed my signals report for the session. No irregular frequencies detected. No side-side channel coordination beyond what was technically permitted. And then I packed my equipment into its case and took the transit corridor back to the human delegation's suite on level 4. Maris was sitting at the head of the conference table when I arrived, documents arranged in front of her in 3 neat stacks. The legal officer was at the side table with 2 comm units open. The technical attachés were doing what technical attachés do in moments of institutional crisis, which is to say they were making lists. Set my case down, Maris looked up. Clear? She said. Clean session, I said. Nothing irregular on any monitored frequency. Good, she said. Sit down. I sat. She looked at the 3 stacks of documents on the table for a moment in that stillness. Then she said, "You know what they don't realize they've done?" It was not a question. She was not asking me. She was saying it aloud because she needed to hear it said aloud, in a room, by a human voice, in the minutes immediately after a vote that had gone exactly as predicted and exactly as planned for. I said, "They've sealed the primary channel." "They've sealed the primary channel," she agreed. "Not the secondary. Not the tertiary. Not the 4 supplemental routing paths that we filed as domestic technical infrastructure under Article 17 of the original Accord. Not the relay network we registered as a survey coordination system under the Kithrani Transit Corridor amendments of 6 years ago. Not any of the 11 additional nodes that exist, legally, inside the treaty framework they just invoked against us." She picked up one of the documents from the left-hand stack and set it on top of the middle stack. "They sealed one channel, the one we stopped using 3 years ago." I had known this. I had been part of building it. But hearing her say it in that room, 4 hours after the vote, still did something to the air in the space between my ribs. "The compact takes effect at session close," I said. "Yes," she said. "We'll file our final primary channel documentation before close as required. Everything in order, all courtesy observed." She paused. "Then we'll go home." "And Ambassador Solen?" She looked at me with something that I have spent 23 years since trying to name precisely. It was not satisfaction. Satisfaction has warmth in it. What I saw in Maris's eyes in that moment was older than satisfaction and quieter and had no warmth in it at all. "Ambassador Solen," she said, "will come home when she's ready." I want to be precise about what I knew at that point and what I did not know. I knew that Earth's primary Velhari channel, the one the signatories had just voted to seal, had been our principal diplomatic communications route the first 8 years of our Accord membership. I knew that 3 years before the Helion Compact vote, we had quietly shifted our operational communications traffic to secondary and tertiary pathways, citing infrastructure modernization, and that the primary channel had carried almost nothing since then, except the minimum contact traffic that maintained our official registration numbers. I knew, because I had drafted some of the registration documentation myself, that a series of what appeared to be technical infrastructure filings under various sub-articles of the Accord had, over the course of 7 years, established a parallel signals architecture inside the treaty framework. I knew this architecture was legal. I had read every provision. I had read the signatories' own drafting notes to confirm there was no language that touched it. What I did not know, precisely, what Ambassador Solen Darath was doing on the other side of the channel. I knew she existed. I knew she was, technically, recalled. Her credentials had been suspended in an earlier procedural dispute 18 months before the Helion Compact vote, when the Kithrani anchor block had raised a qualification challenge to her accreditation documentation. The challenge held up on narrow grounds. Darath had departed the station formally, with all the paperwork filed in good order. The signatories had considered that matter closed. What I did not know, and what the signatories certainly did not know, precise nature of the work she had been doing since her recall. I knew the broad shape of it because Maris had told me the broad shape in a 20-minute conversation 18 months prior, sitting at this same conference table, in this same room, after the credential challenge had been upheld and Darath's departure date was set. What Maris had told me was this: that Darath was not finished, that Darath was in fact barely started, and that the work she was going to do over the next year and a half required precisely the kind of quiet that a formal recall provided. I had nodded. I had not asked further questions. In my line of work, you learn that the questions you do not ask are often the most useful ones you possess. So when I say I did not know precisely what Darath was doing, I mean that I did not know the specifics, the technical architecture, particular provisions she was working through, the exact instrument she was building. I knew it was being built. I knew it would be ready. I knew that when it was ready, the door it opened would not be the door the signatories were watching. That is the thing about sealing a channel. You have to know all of them. We filed our final primary channel documentation 2 hours before session close. Every form in order, every courtesy observed, every timestamp logged. The legal officer was meticulous. At session close, the Helion Compact took effect. Primary channel went dark on the Velhari end. The human delegation's credentials were formally suspended and the access termination confirmed by Commission's own systems. We packed, we booked transit, we went home. The Commission's observation of our departure, as best I was ever able to reconstruct from signals intelligence gathered in subsequent years, was essentially administrative. They confirmed the departure, they logged the credential termination, they noted in the appropriate records that the primary channel was sealed, and the 12-year review cycle had commenced. And then at some point in the days following, I cannot pin it to an exact date, but within the first week, the Commission's attention moved to other business, as institutional attention does when a matter has been resolved to the institution's satisfaction. The signatories, as best I was ever able to reconstruct from the intelligence we gathered over the subsequent years, believed that they had accomplished something clean and permanent. The Velhari Anchor Block's internal communications, which I was not monitoring at the time but which came to us through other pathways later, after everything had concluded, show a tone that I can only describe as settled. As if a door had been shut and the latch had caught, and the sound of that catch was satisfying in a way that required no further attention. Veteran Saul, in the Commission's own internal record, noted the close of the session, the brief annotation. Article 9 certification complete. Primary channel access suspended per Helion Compact terms. 12-year review cycle commenced. Delegation departure confirmed. And then, beneath that, a single additional line that I have thought about, often in the years since, because it illuminates something essential about what the Commission believed it understood. No outstanding obligations. No outstanding obligations. I have worked in signals intelligence for 37 years. I have sat in more council chambers, treaty rooms, assembly floors, and commission galleries than I can accurately count. I have watched species with deep archives and long memories and sophisticated intelligence, apparatuses make, with great confidence and considerable ceremony, the same essential error. They look at the channels they can see. They count the channels they know about. They seal the ones that inconvenience them. And then they write in their records that there are no outstanding obligations, because what they mean by obligation is what they owe and what is owed to them, and they have tallied both columns and found them balanced. What they have not done, what they rarely do, because it requires imagining a type of patience they do not recognize as possible, is ask what the other party has been building while everyone was looking at the columns. The 14 years that followed were not, from the outside, eventful. Earth remained outside the Velhari Accord's primary treaty framework. The Helion Compact's channel suspension was in effect. We did not petition for early review. We were entitled to petition at the 8-year mark, and we did not do so. The signatories noted this in their records, initially with some attention and then with diminishing attention as the years passed, and we continued to not petition. By the 10th year, the Commission's internal references to the Earth suspension had become a form of administrative notation rather than an active concern. The sort of thing that clerks log because they are required to log it, not because anyone is thinking about it. In the 3rd year, there was a brief flurry of Commission attention when the Theresi delegation formally proposed reopening the review timeline. Vath Vel, who was still in his post, would remain in it for another 4 years, submitted a floor proposal to accelerate the 8-year review to a 5-year review, on the grounds that the Helion Compact's channel suspension had achieved its intended deterrent effect, and that extended suspension served no additional purpose. The proposal was voted down 8-3. Velhari Anchor Block had the numbers and used them without hesitation. Vel registered his disagreement in the formal record and said nothing more publicly. I noted it. It went into the intelligence file under the heading of potential future leverage, which is where useful information goes when you do not yet know how it will be useful. In the 6th year, the Ardesi trade representatives withdrew from the Velhari Anchor Block on an unrelated routing dispute, and thereafter voted independently on commission business. This meant the Velhari could no longer guarantee a majority on contested questions, without building a new coalition, which they proceeded to do. But the new coalition was less cohesive than the old one, and required more negotiation to maintain. The commission that had voted unanimously for Article 9 was 6 years later, a more fractured body. None of that directly affected the Earth's suspension. But it affected the climate of the room, and the climate of the room matters, always, more than the formal count of committed votes. What the Commission could not see, because the registration of technical infrastructure under treaty, sub-articles, does not generate the kind of record that attracts attention at the Commission floor level, and because the legal language in question had been drafted by a team of humans who had spent 4 years studying the Accord's own provisions, specifically to understand where its attention was not directed, was that the parallel architecture was growing. The secondary and tertiary channels remained in place and operational. 4 of the supplemental ROUTAM nodes had been expanded. 2 of the relay stations, registered as survey coordination infrastructure, had been upgraded with additional capacity that was, to the letter of the registration, language, within the parameters of what survey coordination technically encompassed under the Accord's definitions annex. The 11 additional nodes had become 17. The signals architecture that the Commission had no instrument to see had, over 14 years, grown into something larger than what the primary channel had ever carried. None of this was secret. It was all registered. It was all in the treaty framework. It was all legal. It was simply not where the signatories were looking, and Ambassador Darth worked. I did not see her in those 14 years. Our communication was one-directional, technical, routed through channels that carried off no messages, only operational data. But I could read the architecture she was building in the structure of what arrived through those channels. She had always been, in my experience, a person of extraordinary patience. Not the patience of waiting, that is a passive thing, and Darath was not passive. The patience of construction, patience of someone who understands that the thing they are building will only be as good as the foundation it rests on, and who is therefore willing to take the time, however much time it requires, to pour the foundation correctly. She had a staff of 11 by the 4th year. By the 9th year, they numbered 34. They worked inside the treaty framework, using the routing paths, the registered nodes, the sub-article designations, and what they built, piece by piece, across 14 years, was a communications and diplomatic infrastructure that could operate entirely independently of the primary, Velhari channel, not outside the Accord, inside it, using the Accord's own language, its own provisions, its own definitional architecture. The signatories had given them the materials. They had simply not expected anyone to read the blueprint closely enough to understand what could be made from them. What that building looked like from the inside, I have pieced together from conversations with several of Darath's staff, who served with her across the full 14 years. It was not glamorous work. It was the work of reading long documents carefully and identifying the specific language that permitted a specific registration that no one had previously thought to make. It was the work of filing those registrations in the correct fonts form, through the correct channels, and then waiting to confirm that no objection was raised, which objections rarely were. The filings were technically correct and technically unremarkable, the sort of routine infrastructure notation that commission clerks process and log without referring to the floor. It was the work of maintaining those registrations through the annual certification cycles that the Accord required, which meant that every year, exception, Darath filed the appropriate maintenance documentation and paid the appropriate fees and received the appropriate informations logged and time-stamped in the Commission's own records. 14 years of annual certification cycles, 10 years of maintenance documentation. 14 years of a commission that had decided there were no outstanding obligations and had therefore not read what was being filed directly into its own records. The instrument Darth eventually prepared was filed on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I was in my office on level 2 of the Human Diplomatic Corps building in the Capitol when the notification came, the tertiary channel, and my office calendar shows a Tuesday. The instrument was a formal reaccreditation petition under Article 17 subsection C of the original Velhari Accord, the same subsection under which most of the supplemental routing nodes had been registered. Subsection C, concerned with of accredited technical infrastructure operators to direct representation before the Commission in matters affecting the infrastructure they operated. The infrastructure Darath's team had built over 14 years was, technically, a registered technical infrastructure under that subsection. Its operators were technically entitled to direct representation. Petition was 312 pages. It was accompanied by 14 years of operational records, all technically certified, all demonstrably with subsection's provisions. It cited 47 specific articles and subarticles of the Accord. It had been reviewed by 8 treaty lawyers, 6 of whom the signatories' own commission had certified as Accord-qualified practitioners. It was, in the judgment of everyone on our legal team who reviewed it before filing, airtight. Maris called me into her office the afternoon before it was filed. She was 68 by then, the gray in her hair complete, and she had the look she sometimes got in the later years of the work. Not tired exactly, carrying something heavy in a way that had become so habitual, it no longer showed as effort. She showed me the final version of the instrument on her screen. I read the first 3 pages and the last page, and enough of the middle too. Understand the structure. She did it, I said. She did it, Maris said. What happens when the Commission receives it? Maris looked at her screen for a moment. Then she said, they will have to schedule a floor session. They cannot not schedule one. The subsection is mandatory. Within 90 days of a qualifying petition, the Commission must open the floor to direct representation from the petitioning infrastructure operators. She paused. They will look for a procedural route to deny the petition before the floor session. They will not find one. I have had our legal team spend 18 months specifically ensuring there is no procedural route. And Dareth? She'll attend the session, Maris said. I'll attend the session. You will attend the session. From the gallery, I said. From the gallery, she agreed. Bring frequencies as usual. She looked at me with that expression she sometimes had. The one that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that existed in the space where a smile would be in a different person. You'll want a good seat. Petition was filed the next morning. The Commission's receipt was confirmed through the tertiary channel at the second hour. Our legal officer noted the timestamp. I noted it. The notification passed through the registered routing system in perfect order at the speeds the infrastructure supported, to every node in the network Dareth had built. The Commission's first response came 41 hours later, a procedural core on the infrastructure registration numbers cited in the petition. Our legal team responded within the hour with complete documentation. The Commission's second response came 3 days after that. Formal notice that a qualified review panel had been convened to assess the petition's eligibility. We noted this. The review panel had 60 days to report. It reported in 43. The finding was that the petition was procedurally valid and the Commission was obligated to schedule a floor session for direct representation. I want to tell you what happened in those 43 days inside the Commission's deliberative process, because it is relevant to understanding the weight of what Darath had built, the internal records, which came to us through our own channels. In the months after the session, through the kind of back route intelligence work that forms the quiet majority of my career's actual output, show what I can only describe as a sustained and focused effort to find a way out of the box. 7 working groups convened. 12 precedent reviews were commissioned from the Accord's own legal archive. 3 direct consultations were held between Vethran Saul, who had moved from lead coordinator to senior Accord steward in the intervening years, a more senior position with broader authority, and the Kethrani Anchor Block's lead legal officer, a figure named Sethvin Karal, whose work I had been tracking for 9 years and who was, by any measure I could apply, exceptionally capable. They found nothing. The provisions were clear. The registration was valid. The petition was properly constituted. The floor session was mandatory. I have read those 43 days of internal records many times. Not because I needed the intelligence. By the time those records came to us, the session had already concluded and the outcome was already known. I read them, because they are instructive in a way that I continue to find useful when I teach. What they show is a sophisticated institution, staffed by capable individuals, working very hard to solve a problem that does not have a solution. Not because the problem is inherently unsolvable, because the solution existed 14 years earlier, and the window for it had long since closed. The working groups kept arriving at the same wall. The precedent reviews kept failing to find applicable precedent because no one had previously attempted to build a secondary communications infrastructure inside an existing treaty framework, while that framework's governing body believed the relevant party had been successfully silenced. It had not been done before. There was no precedent for it, because it required a specific combination of legal creativity and operational patience and institutional invisibility that was rare enough to be, in practice, without historical analog. Sethan Karal, what I can reconstruct of the private consultations with veteran Saul was the first inside the commission to understand the full scope of what had been done. The internal record of one consultation, at the 31st day of the 43, contains a line attributed to him that I have quoted to my students more than once. It reads, in translation from the Kethrani Formal Register, "The infrastructure has been there for 14 years. We have been receiving its maintenance filings every year for 14 years. We certified its registration annually. We have acknowledged, in our own records, every component of this petition, piecemeal, across the entire period of suspension. There is then a notation in the record that indicates a pause of some duration before the next statement. And then, we built the door ourselves. We just did not notice we were building it. The notice was filed on a Thursday. The session would convene in 30 days, at the 3rd hour, station time. I booked my gallery seat that afternoon. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in those 30 days. It is because it is relevant to understanding something about this work that is easy to lose sight of after the fact, when the outcome is known, and the logic seems obvious in retrospect. In those 30 days, I felt something that I have since learned to call quiet sorrow, for want of a better name. Not for what was about to happen to the commission, that I had been working toward for 14 years, and I believed then as I believe now that it was just. What I felt quiet sorrow for was the years themselves, for what it had cost to build something over 14 years, in silence, without recognition, without even the basic dignity of having the work acknowledged as work. For Dareth, who had spent 14 years of her professional life constructing an instrument in a space the commission didn't know existed, and who was now about to walk through a door with it, and who had not once, in all that time, been thanked for the saints that the work required. Maris, who had walked out of a chamber on the day of the vote with her documents under her arm and said nothing, and had then spent 14 years continuing to say nothing in public, while doing everything in private. For the legal officer whose name was Seth Verandis, and who had retired 3 years before the session and did not live to see it, and who had spent 7 years drafting and cross-referencing infrastructure filings, so meticulous that not one of them had generated a commission objection, for all of it, the weight of it, and the patience of it, and the cost of it in years. There is a version of this story that centers on the cleverness of the instrument. And it was clever, genuinely, the kind of cleverness that is only recognizable as such in retrospect, because it does not look like cleverness when it is in progress. It looks like filing. It looks like documentation. It looks like the kind of meticulous, unremarkable administrative persistence that earns no recognition precisely because it does not ask for any. People write histories of negotiations, and they describe the brilliant legal insight, the audacious move, the moment when a single argument changed the room. What they almost never describe is the 11 years of correct paperwork that preceded the argument and made it possible. The paperwork is not the story they want to tell, but it is the story that actually happened, and it was done by people who knew when they were doing it that they would not be the ones in the room when it finally mattered. Seth Verandis knew that. He filed his last infrastructure certification 2 years before the petition was ready, 6 months before the cancer was diagnosed, 9 months before he died. He knew the instrument he was building into the commission's records. He knew he would not be there when Darath placed the document on the Ark. He filed the certification anyway, in the same careful form he had used for every previous one, and then he went home, and 4 months later he was in hospital, and 8 months after that he was gone. His name is not in the formal finding. It is in the registration records, as the certifying officer on 11 of the 17 nodes. I do not imagine the Commission has ever looked at those records closely enough to see it. There I have been asked since whether I was angry. I was not angry. Anger is a hot thing and burns quickly. I carried in those 30 days was colder, older than anger. It was the accumulated knowledge of exactly what had been done, and exactly what it had cost, and exactly what was about to be answered, and the knowledge that answering it would not undo the cost. That is the nature of the work. Pair, and you wait, and when the door opens the years are still spent. You do not get them back. The session convened at the 3rd hour. I was in the gallery 30 minutes before the bell, seated in the front row of the observer tier, with my monitoring equipment in the case at my feet and my data tablet on my knee. I did not open the monitoring equipment. I had cleared the session signals oversight with Maris the week before. She had brought in a junior officer to handle the routine frequency watch. I was there to observe. For once in 37 years, simply to observe. The chamber had the same pale greenish-white light. The Kathrani found it comfortable. I had long since stopped noticing that it made human faces look ill. The delegations filed in at their usual pace and took their arcs. The Kathrani anchor block. The Ardesi trade representatives. The Theresi, represented now by a different senior diplomat than the Anvath Vel I remembered from 14 years before. He had retired 6 years ago, I knew from our intelligence records, and his replacement was younger, with less history on this question. The remaining delegations in their places, commission clerks at their side tables, Vethrenssol's successor as lead coordinator, a Velhari home delegation senior named Ethril Sovan, at the central podium. The petitioner's arc was at the floor level, directly opposite the coordinating podium. It had been prepared for the session. Chairs set, the surface clear, the Commission's own technical support team having confirmed the ARC systems operational. It had been prepared because the petition was valid, and the representation was mandatory, and the Commission did its paperwork, correctly regardless of what it thought about the paperwork. At the 3rd hour, the bell sounded. Lead coordinator Ethril Safan opened the session and read the agenda. There was one item, consideration of the direct representation petition filed under Article 17, subsection C, by the operators of the Accord-registered technical infrastructure designated in the petition documents. Then she said, in the trade pigeon, the Commission notes that the petition was filed on behalf of a principal named Solen Darath. The Commission invites the petitioner to present. The door at the chamber floor level, not the gallery door, not the corridor entrance the delegations used, the floor-level door on the east wall that connected the chamber to the station's internal transit corridor, opened. Solen Darath walked in. I want to tell you what she looked like because it matters. She was 63 years old. She had the build of someone who had spent decades doing physical work alongside intellectual work. Compact, direct in her movement, with none of the deliberate grace that some career diplomats cultivate as a substitute for authority. She was wearing standard diplomatic formal attire, dark coat, no insignia, which was correct for a petitioner rather than a credentialed envoy. Hair was gray, cut short, the same way I remembered it from the last time I had seen her in person, which was 20 months before the Helion Compact vote, 16 years ago. She was carrying a document case in her right hand, the kind with a sealed latch. She walked to the petitioner's arc. She did not look at the delegations. She did not look at the coordinating podium. She set the document case on the arc surface, unlatched it, and opened it. She took out a single document, one page, I could see from the gallery, and placed it on the arc surface face down. Then she closed the case and stood behind the arc with her hands at her sides. The chamber was very quiet. Lead coordinator Ethril Savan said, in the trade pigeon, the Commission acknowledges the petitioner's presence. The Commission notes that the petitioner's credentials under the primary Velhari channel were suspended 14 years ago, and that the current appearance is therefore governed exclusively by the terms of Article 17, subsection C. Dareth said nothing. I watched Veteran Saul. He was in the senior Accord steward's position, at the side of the floor, in a chair that was technically not a delegation seat, but was clearly the most significant seat in the room. His face was doing something I had never seen it do in 11 years of watching him. Not panic. Veteran Saul was not the panicking kind. But there was, in the careful architecture of his composed expression, a calculation happening that was visible precisely because it was so trolled. He was looking at Dareth, and he was thinking, and what he was thinking was a version of the same question that was moving, see from the gallery, through every delegation in the room. What is she holding? Ethel Sovan continued. Commission invites the petitioner to present the grounds for direct representation, as specified in the petition. Dareth reached forward and turned the document over. She slid it across the arc surface to the center, so that it lay flat and readable. Then she stepped back. One of the commission clerks, it was Anveth's successor, a younger Theresi, approached the arc, picked up the document, and carried it to the coordinating podium. Ethel Sovan read it. I watched her read it. The reading took perhaps 40 seconds, then she looked up, at the floor, and I saw something pass through her expression that the pale green light of the chamber could not quite flatten. The commission, she said and stopped. She tried again. The commission has received the petitioner's presentation instrument. What the document was, I learned later from our legal officer's description. It was a single-page certification, a formal attestation, signed by 8 Accord-certified treaty practitioners from 4 member species, that the infrastructure operated by the petitioner under Article 17, subsection C encompassed, as of the date of filing, 17 registered routing nodes, 4 certified relay stations, 11 supplemental communications pathways, and a combined traffic capacity that, under the Commission's own definitions annex, qualified the infrastructure as a primary diplomatic communications system, the same classification, held by the primary Velhari channel that the Helion Compact had sealed, which meant that the Helion Compact's channel suspension had sealed one primary diplomatic communications system, and there was now another one, fully inside the treaty framework, registered in the Accord's own records, operated by the party the suspension was meant to silence, not the same channel, a different one, built where no one had been looking, from the materials the treaty itself provided, over 14 years, by a recalled ambassador who had been given the gift of being forgotten. The chamber was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silent self became a kind of presence in the room, weighted, particular, with the specific quality of a silence that descends when a large body of people simultaneously realizes that something they believe to be finished, not finished, has never been finished, and has in fact been proceeding the entire time they believed it had stopped. Ethel Sovan said, in the trade pigeon, the commission will require a recess to review the documentation. Dareth said nothing. She had not, in the entire time she had been in the chamber, met a single word. She turned, picked up her document case, and walked to the door she had entered through. She opened it. She held it for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, in the way a person looks when they are simply breathing the air of a room they have waited a long time to breathe. Then she walked out. The door closed behind her. Maris and I were waiting in the corridor. Maris put one hand briefly on Dareth's arm. Not a grip, not an embrace, just the weight of a hand for a moment, and then withdrew it. Dareth looked at her with an expression that I recognized, now, as the same thing I had seen in Maris's eyes 14 years before, in the delegation suite, in the hours after the vote. Not satisfaction, something colder and quieter than satisfaction, with no warmth in it, and with under that coldness the faint deep shape of all the years that had been spent. Maris said, clean, Dareth said. Every registration, every node. Article 17 holds. Good, Maris said, let's go. We walked out of the corridor. The commission's recess bell was sounding behind us, muffled by the station's transit corridor walls. I carried my monitoring equipment case in my left hand, and Dareth walked beside me, and Maris walked a half step ahead, as she always did, and the transit corridor was the same institutional gray it had always been, lit by the same overhead strips in the same configuration. Nothing had changed in the corridor. Everything had changed in the chamber we had just left. I want to tell you what happened in the commission over the following 6 weeks, because it is relevant to understanding what the instrument actually accomplished and what it cost the signatories to learn it. The recess lasted 4 hours. When the floor session reconvened, the Commission's legal panel had reviewed the documentation and confirmed the certification. The infrastructure was validly registered. The classification as a primary diplomatic communications system held. The Helion Compact's suspension language applied only to the original primary channel. A new primary channel, registered and operational under the treaty framework, was outside the suspension scope. The Kethrani Anchor Block's legal officer, Sethvin Karal, argued for 3 hours that the certification was a procedural manipulation, designed to circumvent the intent of the Helion Compact. This was true. The Commission's own procedural rules, however, governed on intent, not at all, and on the letter of the provisions exclusively. The letter of the provisions was unambiguous. The infrastructure was registered. The classification held. The intent of the compact was not, under Accord law, a relevant consideration. What followed was, by any measure, an extraordinary 3 hours of commission floor argument. I was still in the gallery. I had returned after the corridor walk, after ensuring Dareth and Maris had been seen safely to the transit hub, because I needed to hear what the Commission said and watch how it said it. Sethvin Karal was, as I noted, exceptionally capable. He raised 8 distinct arguments. Each was substantively serious. Each was ultimately addressed by language that Dareth's legal team had already anticipated and incorporated into the registration documentation, in some cases years before the petition was filed. You could see him working through it, the methodical, rigorous mind encountering, one argument at a time, the wall that had been built specifically to withstand each argument he might make. It was like watching a very good climber on a rock face that had been shaped, patiently and invisibly, to have no holds. On the 41st day after the session, the Commission issued a formal finding. The infrastructure operated by the petitioner under Article 17, subsection C, was classified as a primary diplomatic communications system under the Accord's Definitions Annex. Earth's access to Velhari treaty processes through this system could not be suspended under the existing Helion Compact language without a new vote on a new instrument. A new vote on a new instrument required, under the Accord's amendment procedures, a supermajority of 9 of 11 member delegations. The Theresi voted no on the new instrument, as we had known they would. They had abstained on Article 9 of the Compact, which was as close as they could get, at that point, registering their actual position, and the intervening 14 years had not softened their reservations. The Varath voted no. The Halvendi representative, whose name I finally learned during the course of the 6-week process, was Ethrin Sol, and Ethrin Sol voted no. 3 no votes. 9 yes votes required. The new instrument failed. Earth's secondary communications architecture remained inside the Velhari Accord, fully operational without suspension. The Helion Compact was not void, but it had sealed a door that led nowhere, and the door that mattered was standing open. I am 68 years old now. I retired from active signals intelligence 7 years ago, and I teach at the Diplomatic Training Institute, attached to the Foreign Relations Division, which means that once a week, I stand in front of a room of 24-year-olds and try to explain what the work actually is, what it actually costs, and what it actually requires. Most of them come in with ideas about the work that are not wrong, exactly, but are incomplete in ways that matter. They understand the intelligence part, the monitoring, the analysis, the pattern recognition. They are less prepared for the patience part, the part where the work is not exciting and not acknowledged and produces no result that anyone outside the immediate team can see for years at a stretch. I try to teach the patience. I am not sure I always succeed. What I find hardest to teach is the relationship between invisibility and effectiveness. The work that changed something, in this case, was the work that no one saw. The work that was filed quietly into the Commission's own records and certified annually, and never drew an objection, because it was never important enough to attract one. The legal team that drafted those filings spent years specifically making the work not interesting. That is a different discipline than making it good. Making something good that is also specifically uninteresting, in a sustained way, for a 14-year period, is a form of craft that most people do not recognize as craft. I try to name it as such when I teach. I try to make clear that the work that goes unnoticed is not failed work. It may be the most precisely executed work in the whole of an operation. Dareth's team did not fail to be noticed. They succeeded at not being noticed. Those are opposite things. The thing I come back to in those sessions is the question what patience actually is. Not the patience of enduring. Anyone can endure. More or less, if they have no choice. Patience of building. The patience that looks at a space where nothing yet exists and begins to construct something in it, carefully, from available materials, knowing that the construction will take years and that no one will see it happening, and that the only confirmation that you are doing it correctly is the absence of interference. That kind of patience is rarer than it appears, and it requires something that I find very difficult to teach, which is the absolute conviction that the work is worth doing, regardless of whether anyone ever acknowledges that it is being done. Dareth has that conviction. She has always had it. In the 31 years I have known her, I have never once heard her require anyone to confirm that the work mattered. She knew it mattered. She built it anyway. And when she walked through the door the commission did not know existed and placed a single piece of paper on an arc table and said nothing and walked back out, she did not do any of it for acknowledgement. She did it because the instrument was ready and the door was there, and it was time. I have been asked, occasionally, whether she was angry. Whether in those 14 years working in a space that no one was watching, building something that she could not yet use, she carried anger the way I carried the cold weight in those final 30 days. I asked her once. It was 2 years after the session. At a function in the capital where we were both present, a long evening with a great deal of wine, and the kind of conversation that only happens when the work is genuinely finished, and there is no immediate, operational reason to be careful. She thought about the question for a moment, not performing the thought, actually thinking, and then she said, was too busy to be angry. There was always the next registration to file. That is either the truest thing I have ever heard about the nature of the work, or the most stoic, and I have decided over the years that the distinction does not matter. Maris died 4 years ago. Her memorial service was attended by, among others, 3 members of the current Velhari Accord Diplomatic Commission, 2 of whom had been junior delegates in the body at the time of the Helion compact vote and 1 of whom had voted yes on Article 9. I do not know what any of them were thinking at the service. I know what I was thinking. I was thinking about a chamber with pale greenish-white light, and a woman standing behind an arc table holding nothing, in a silence that had been 14 years in the making. The commission wanted to write it as an administrative adjustment, procedural clarification, a technical infrastructure matter that had been resolved through the normal processes of the Accord's legal framework. In their records, if you read the formal finding language, that is what it is. An administrative adjustment. I suppose that is accurate, technically. The instrument was legal. The process was procedural. The framework held. Everything was orderly, from the Commission's own point of view, in the sense that every step followed the rules they had written. But the rules they had written were also the rules that Dareth had read, more carefully than anyone at the Commission level had bothered to read them when drafting, because the people who draft rules of a certain complexity tend to stop reading them with full attention once they believe the framework is settled. The Commission had believed the framework was settled. The channel was sealed, the delegation was gone, the review cycle was running. What more was there to read? A great deal, as it turned out. Article 17, subsection C had been in the original accord from its ratification, 17 years before the Helion Compact. It had been drafted to address a practical concern about infrastructure operators who were not themselves credentialed diplomatic envoys, but who operated systems that were materially relevant to diplomatic processes. The drafters had intended it for relay station operators, surveying contractors, signals maintenance crews. They had not considered the possibility that a diplomatic delegation, upon being excluded from the primary framework, might use the subsection as the legal basis for building an entire new framework inside the old one. The drafters could be forgiven for this. It had not been done before. What they cannot write in the formal finding, because formal findings do not have a category for it, is what it meant that the door had been there the whole time. That for 14 years, while the Commission logged its administrative notations and its 12-year review cycles and its no outstanding obligations, the work had been proceeding. That the channel they had sealed had been irrelevant before they sealed it, and remained irrelevant after. That the woman they had recalled had used her recall as the specific condition of possibility for building the thing that made the recall not matter. I teach that too. I tell them, the most important intelligence question is not what the other party is doing in the space you are watching. It is what they are doing in the space you are not watching, the space you do not know to watch, the space that exists in the gap between what you can see and what you can imagine. The Commission could see the primary channel. They had always been able to see it. They sealed it with great care and considerable ceremony. And they wrote in their records that there were no outstanding obligations, and they were wrong in the way that confident institutions are often wrong. Not in their knowledge of what they could see, in their assumption that what they could see was everything there was. The channel they sealed carried nothing Earth needed. It never had, not in the last 3 years of its operation. It was, by the time Article 9 of the Helion Compact took effect, an administrative artifact, kept open precisely because closing it would have drawn attention we did not want drawn. The Commission saw a channel and voted to close it, and they felt the satisfaction of the latch catching, and they wrote in their records that it was done. 14 years later, a recalled ambassador walked through a door they had never thought to look, and set one page of paper on a table and said nothing at all. And then she walked back out. That is what it looks like when the patience is the right kind. That is what it sounds like when the answer has been ready for 14 years. It sounds like nothing. It sounds like a door opening.